So at this mystery temple of Eleusis, what do you think really happened?
The Telesterion is the initiation hall, but really the root of that word means perfecting rites.
Yeah.
So the perfecting rites are carried out in this hall, where the initiates of the mysteries of Eleusina would enter it and have direct experience of the gods and goddesses that are associated with Eleusis. And, you could say they're epiphanies, but I think they are experienced as out-of-body encounters of the divine directly.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. What if there were a series of portals hidden around the world, gateways that could connect you directly with the divine? Obviously, this sounds like myth, or this sounds just hyper woo. But when you start poking around the history of Western esotericism, and not even just Western esotericism, this is really the picture that is painted, because there were ancient megalithic sites and initiatory mystery temples that seem to serve just that function. The Temple of Eleusis is probably the best known of these sites. It was located just outside of Athens, and it was said that the goddess literally dwelled there, and that you could have a direct experience of her presence. And if that sounds like a reach, an absolute who's who from the ancient world didn't think so. Plato, Plutarch, Herodotus, Sophocles, all absolutely gushed about the beauty and profundity of the Eleusinian mysteries. But what exactly went on there? How exactly did it happen? Unfortunately, a lot of that does and probably will remain an enigma, but there's a lot we do know, a lot we can make educated guesses at, and some things we can probably even reverse engineer. And though that is just barely scratching the surface of this mind meld, I don't want to overly contextualize. I don't want to bash you over the head with exposition. But what I must do, what it is my absolute pleasure to do, is introduce you to Sarah Janes, because she is really doing it. She really is reverse engineering the mysteries to a degree. She relocated to Greece from the UK. She's working directly with experts, and she is taking people to these sacred sites to do a lot more than just sightsee, to actually approach them with a sacred disposition. She also has a book out called Initiation into Dream Mysteries. All of the portals for both Sarah Janes and Third Eye Drops are in the description. But speaking of the latter, we need that algorithm tickled, stimulated, expressed in all ways. Like, sub, comment, share. It really makes a huge difference. Do sub to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to pods. We've got hundreds of audio-only mind melds. And if you want to come muse with me and hundreds of other Wonder Dippers, head over to patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server. We do a book club. We do monthly Zoom hangs. You will be bequeathed with rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. I would truly love to riff with you there. But for now, let's do so with Sarah Janes. I mean, I've fallen in love with Greece from a completely different POV, though it does look beautiful in the literal sense. I've fallen in love with the sort of thought world, for lack of a better term, like, particularly the Neoplatonic and like broadly Hellenic mystical tradition that has now flowed into Western esotericism in general. And there are just so many facets of it that endlessly fascinate me. But one that you have taken a particular interest in and are exploring in ways that very few people are is dreaming, incubation. From the modern Western POV, we have an idea about what dreams are. But in the ancient world, seemingly there was a completely different philosophical view on what dreams are and how they fit into reality. And maybe I'm generalizing by saying that, but I would love to hear you just generally riff on how they thought about dreams and how that's influenced you personally.
Well, one thing I think you could say quite generally about perceptions of dreams in ancient cultures is that they were recognized as being a way of accessing ancestors, the divine. And if you look at ancient dream interpretation cross-culturally I specialize in the sort of Western esoteric tradition, but I think it's true everywhere in the world, that dreams are seen as being windows into the future, and not necessarily in the way that we might think of with regards to seeing the future playing out in a dream, but in an oracular sense. So
Yeah.
to me, that does seem to speak volumes about the perception of dreams in the ancient world, and not just dreams, about the perception of reality, the perception of time, the perception of what might happen to the soul once you die. And I think that that's something that really interests me, because I think one of the important features for dreams these days for people, and meaningful dreams that people regularly have, are interactions with deceased loved ones.
Yeah.
And I suspect that interactions with the deceased in ancient times gave rise to ideas about the soul perpetuating after death, or there being some other realm that the deceased still exist in.
Yeah. Yeah. In that realm, I mean, I guess, like, have you by chance read Dream in the Underworld by James Hillman?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Hillman, Jung, I think these are the sort of gateway drugs back into taking dreams, the imaginal, you whatever you want to call it, the psycho spiritual, seriously again. But I also think that the ancient way of viewing whatever this realm is, this whatever you want to call it, is unavoidably just literal. It's not reducible to psychology. It's not reducible to mythology or archetypes. It is literally another realm that is connected to ours, perhaps a realm that we are cohabitating in unknowingly, or are maybe where maybe there's a veil between those realms that we can't normally peer through. Yet when circumstances are right, when night falls, when we go to sleep, when our consciousness does something to penetrate that veil, it's like extremely familiar. It's like, oh yeah, I've been here many times. Like, this is, I belong here just as much as I belong there. And what that realm is just, how do you think they thought about it, and how do you think about it? Do you take it as a, like, an ontological literal?
I guess I think about it like the imaginal fabric of reality. So it's all part of the weave of life. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I really love in Anatolian dream interpretation, they say that women were the best dream interpreters in ancient Anatolia. The old women were the best dream
Mhm.
interpreters. And that in order to unpick a dream upon waking, because there are also these kind of loose classifications of types of dream. So there's a dream in which you have a divine epiphany, a direct contact or audience with a god or goddess or a divine entity. There are dreams that are like riddles that need to be interpreted. So in Anatolia, they talk about dreams being knots, and that a dream interpreter undoes these
Oh,
knots in the
cool.
morning, which I really like. And actually, a friend of mine told me recently that when she knits in the morning, because obviously weaving was seen as an activity that women carried out almost exclusively. When she knits in the morning, she has better recollection of her dreams. So there's something about the
Oh.
process, and I've often considered that those micro movements, those tiny little movements that you make, that you associate with writing, drawing, painting, knitting, anything kind of crafty and detail orientated, does seem to be good for encouraging remembering. And that's another thing
Mm.
I was going to say about dream memory. To me, like, my muse is Minimosini, the goddess of remembrance, because I think there's a lot more interesting dimensions that are quite unexplored by modern consciousness researchers, for example, about how memory functions in dream states, because there's a really weird kind of memory that occurs in dream states, where in a dream state, quite often, you can remember previous dreams that you don't seem to be able to access in ordinary waking consciousness. So there seems to be almost like a sort of shadow memory neural connectivity there. It's like we've got two selves, that we've got
Yeah.
like a dream self and a waking self. that I think that you can create through lucid dreaming. You can create a kind of feedback with.
Yeah, you talk about, I think you call it the mirror realm, right? In your book. I thought that was really cool. And what you're saying about knitting helping you thin the veil somehow, it makes a strange amount of sense because knitting, the repetition involved, it's almost like some kind of physical mantra that you're doing, right?
Mm,
And I would imagine that, just from my experience in meditation or doing something that is repetitive, it's probably quieting down the frontal lobe. It's probably slowing your brain waves. It's getting you out of this, you know, beta wave sort of first person ego based view of interfacing with reality. And clearly that is a prerequisite for entering these states, whether you're getting there through
mm.
sleep, through meditation, um, through ingestion of psychedelics, whatever it is. Like, you clearly have to interrupt that ego structure and move into a different kind of perception and sense of self where things are more malleable. um but yeah, talk a little bit about this mirror realm, because that's something that I think has massive implications, not just for dreaming, but almost everything in the sort of, not even just Western esoteric tradition. I think almost every esoteric tradition takes seriously this idea that there's this realm of mind or nous or um, astral or whatever you want to call it that you already kind of exist within with some other kind of body. Um, and those two ideas just sound really indistinguishable.
Well, it's also in Star Trek.
You're right.
You've got it a mind meld. So they talk about the mirror realm in Star Trek a lot, and the mirror world. And I think for me, because I'm very interested in how material culture, a very early material culture, starts to influence things like creation myths, for example. So mirrors do seem to play into this idea of, we have this material, physical object that's now part of culture, and then we can start to develop um, metaphysical, philosophical ideas around what the mirror surface means and how this could be overlaid upon our vision of reality. So I think a lot about creation myths and how, the earliest creation myths are often astral and celestial and observing celestial events. Then you get things like rain or mud, and then you get pottery and clay and things being made on a potter's wheel. And now we're talking about simulation theory because we have
Right.
computer games, and it will be an AI and an intelligence, an alien intelligence that creates humanity on Earth. So mirrors really interest me because there are kind of traceable psychiatric disorders that you can link with mirrors being like commonplace household furniture. So I think one of the kings of France had this condition called the mirror delusion, where you think, the glass delusion rather, where because of the kind of association that we have with our environment and the outside world, with our material culture, mirrors were being used a lot, and a number of people developed this condition whereby they thought that they started to believe they were made of glass or mirror, and that they would shatter if anyone pushed them too much. So I find that very interesting because we do, one of the things that I'm interested in researching is how environments can heal people, and the fact that if you put someone in a healthy environment, a beautiful environment, a natural environment, they're more likely to recover quickly and heal up more speedily than they would if they're in a detrimental, not very wholesome, healthy, beautiful environment. And I think that was something that they recognized in ancient holistic sanctuaries. And Asclepius is the divine physician. So he's the god of healing and physical treatment for sickness in the ancient Greek world. But the treatment that you would get at an Asclepion was totally holistic. So you'd have everything, from psychodrama in the theatre for catharsis and purging, and nature therapy by immersing yourself in sacred springs, intellectual stimulation from reading in the library. They really thought about making the place beautiful and making a kind of divine precinct that could bring the divinity to the surface in humanity, and heal them that way. So sleeping and dreaming was a very important part of it, but it wasn't Quite often people that research dreams or are interested in the dream thing forget about the other holistic treatments that were on offer, but it's part of a complete package, and I'm very interested in holism, and Igia, who's Asclepius's daughter, is the
Mm.
personification of wholeness and soundness and health. And, to go and be treated at an Asclepia in ancient times was to have this kind of perfecting of the soul, mind, and body experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a massively underappreciated facet, I think, of wellness and healing and just feeling like a vivified being. Like recently I went, so this may not sound super, um influential, but I went to the state capitol building in the state that I live in recently, and it's actually this incredibly beautiful, symbol laden, um Italian marble composed massive building. And I don't think most people walk in there and think like, "Oh, this building is a masterpiece of sacred geometry and Masonic, Western esoteric, hermetic imagery," but it is. And when you go in there and you really think about the intention and layers of meaning that are in this building and contemplate it, it does inspire awe and it does fill you with some kind of quintessence. And I can only imagine, like literally, I mean, now that I'm into everything I'm into, I enter that building thinking even more about what must it have been like to go into a building like this where everyone entered it understanding the significance and the symbolism, and people are, chanting and rituals are being done and incense is being lit. Like my soul aches for that reality that is now sadly lost in most places. But yeah, I think we widely misunderestimate the power of just beautiful environments and symbol and meaning being
Mm.
imbued into giant stones. Like we live in an apps, we're just completely destitute and bereft of that. We're living in boxes, straight lines, 90-degree angles, no symbols whatsoever unless we put them on our walls.
Mm.
And I think that that does have a toll. Like it's some
It's an
kind of strange
amazing
toll.
It's an amazing language, though, to start to get to understand. I
Yes.
started to teach myself hieroglyphs during lockdown.
Mm,
And I've done a lecture series on Egyptology. I'm still kind of do it occasionally, but it's I interview or I invite presenters who are Egyptologists and ancient cultural historians to talk about ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. And I found it fascinating. And during lockdown, I was completely obsessed with learning hieroglyphs and using reed pens and ink. And to then learn quite a lot and get a kind of intuitive sense for it as well, like a sort of feel for it and a delight in it, actually. To then go to a museum and be able to make sense out of the inscriptions was
mm,
unbelievable. And then it occurred to me that if you're literate in hieroglyphs now or in ancient times, that because the hieroglyphs are sort of pictorial representations of real things in the world, every now and again, as a scribe in ancient Egypt, the world would conjure up a constellation of these signs that you could read as if God is speaking directly
right.
to you through the things of the world. And I think that, I guess that's an animist idea, but I believe that many ancient people just had that direct experience of the things of the world as being God talking to them through the world and just having an absolute direct relationship with divinity all the time.
Yeah.
But because, hieroglyphs are one of the best sort of niche techniques learning about hieroglyphs to change dreaming, because hieroglyphs work when you're learning hieroglyphs. You can't help but make visual associations, as well as obviously the phonetic values that the letters and the signs have. You also make these visual associations when you see a word. And so that works in a very similar way to the way dreaming works. So I do suspect that people in ancient times, especially when they're using hieroglyphic scripts, were prolific dreamers, because hieroglyphs and pictorial representation things are very conducive to vivid dreaming.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole sensation that you feel with your entire body and mind, it's very, it really, I think today I guess we'd call it a synchronicity. That experience of feeling like the divine is speaking to you through some kind of orchestrated set of circumstances. And I think I first read the word synthemata in Gregory Shaw's book, Theurgy and the Soul. And people like Neoplatonists like Iamblichus, Proclus, they talked about this idea. I'm going to resist the urge to go on this ramble again because I've done it numerous times on the show. But it's one of those ideas that connects a lot of dots, like this idea that there are these tokens of archetypal divinity disseminated throughout all of nature, and they exist in plants and animals, in stones, in you, in your soul, in your psyche. And language itself, like we probably, most people puzzle over, well, why was language itself in a culture like ancient Egypt, let's say, why was language itself associated with the sacred, with scribes, with, you know compared to how we use language today in this incredibly just utilitarian fashion? I think it's pretty clearly because they were trying to make a language system out of sacred notions.
Yes.
Like,
And the
yeah.
language system and the script system actually directly expressed the things. And I think Greek, ancient Greek, is a kind of bridge language, because
Mm,
now I'm learning Greek. And actually, there's more ancient Egyptian words in Greek and in even English than we think, because they've kind of descended through the Greek. But
wow.
but Greek, once I started to learn Greek, I felt like kind of impoverished by being an English speaker, because the language is not as expressive. You can't sort of as succinctly express a concept as you can in Greek. Like, Greek is so direct. Someone I know, Alexandros Pagitas, talks about how, like, ancient Greek is a sort of self-illuminated language. So
Wow.
it reveals itself because the building blocks of every Greek word are kind of components that express the exact thing. So take the word chrysanthemum, for example, as a flower, golden flower. It's exactly what it says on the tin in Greek. In English, you have to know Greek to know what chrysanthemum means. So you have to go through, kind of reverse engineer the abstraction of English to get to the root and the truth. And I do wonder, as we evolve as a species and as language evolves, might we return to Greek? Because actually it's the language that we use to name all of scientific things and
Mm.
biological things. And it's kind of pure, it's very easy and sensible language. It was invented out of necessity to be simple and to be understood by a lot of different people. I kind of wonder if we might return to it.
I would love to. How are you finding learning ancient Greek? It seems like it would be a
I love
challenge.
it. I'm hoping that next year I've got more kind of online work that I can do. So I can do a BA in archaeology in ancient Greek.
That would be
That's my
cool.
plan. Yeah, in Athens
Mm,
as well, because there's a English language course in Athens.
very cool. So we've been sort of orbiting around something that you're directly involved in, that you're trying to, a practice you're trying to bring people to, that is probably one of the most, if not the most, ancient practices to have a direct experience of this other realm, whatever you want to call it, which is incubation, which is essentially, it goes back pretty much as far as we can see into history, probably in almost every kind of local shamanism imaginable. Um, for people that want to look into this, look into the work of Peter Kingsley. But so essentially, it's this in its most basic form. It's go somewhere in darkness, cut off from sensory input for a very long time, and you enter into what Kingsley calls consciousness itself.
Mm.
This mode of consciousness that isn't sleeping, it isn't being awake, it isn't even meditating, it's something completely unique that you can only achieve through prolonged periods of being cut off from your senses, I guess. And you gain some kind of new, more basic awareness that illuminates your psyche and your soul and modes of awareness that you didn't even know you had. Um, and you're and then of course in the later Greek context, as you well know, this becomes a practice at sacred sites for healing, to try to have, oracular insights. And you're actually taking people, right, to living near one of these famous sites yourself, right?
Yeah, I live in Epidavros, which is where the biggest and best sanctuary of Asclepius was in Greece.
I need to know more. How did this start? What are you doing? How much do we know about the specifics of what went on there?
Quite a lot, because they kept really detailed records. The what they call enkymesis, the sacred sleep part of it, was one aspect of the kind of healing protocol that a patient would receive when they went to one of these sanctuaries. So it's a sacred precinct. It's like a spa or a holistic healing center. It's something that we should probably still have these days, but I suspect that it's only something that's accessible for very wealthy people. Right. But they're quite kind of like vast complexes. At the moment, the archaeological site that exists in Epidavros, you find that there's a huge, fantastic, like acoustically perfect ancient theatre there. And when tourists come to visit, because it is on the kind of tourist roadmap, they tend to get dumped off at the theatre, look at that for half an hour, then get back in the coach, which is great for me because the rest of the sanctuary gets pretty much ignored. There's a small museum on the site, but basically, like, drama theatre was considered a form of healing, and it was considered a form of healing that could bring about catharsis. Like every Greek theatre doubles as a temple to Dionysus. So the kind of ecstasy, the purging and the catharsis that happens when you watch a tragedy or a comedy or drama acts upon the soul and enables you to release your anxieties, tensions, your fears, and I think this idea of treating the soul is really important, because one of the biggest problems in medicine these days is the fact that there's no sense of a person having a soul or a spiritual dimension to themselves. And it was very important in ancient Greece to treat every part of the body. It was a completely holistic approach. So then you have this whole sanctuary basically developed around these sacred springs that come from Mount Kykeon, and they've discovered that there was a goddess worshipped even in Neolithic times on this mountain. So this water was especially good quality, was recognized as being healing. People left votive offerings at this mountain sanctuary. And in later times, it was taken over by Apollo Maliatus, who's a local form of Apollo. Apollo is Asclepius's father. And so there's also some interesting similarities there so in the Roman pantheon, you have Jove, and in Etrusca, you have Jove and Virgovis. So you have a kind of an underworld sun or Apollo, which I think Asclepius represents, because he's a kind of chthonic deity, and he has this nourishing, healing property that a lot of chthonic deities do have. Like, he's of the earth. His symbol is the serpent and the dog.
Yeah,
and
his relationship to dreaming as well, because dreaming.
Yes,
he's a chthonic deity.
Yeah, and he was
Thanatos' brother.
Exactly. So Hypnos and Thanatos are seen as brothers. So there's something as well, kind of symbolically, that by entering into the dream with Asclepius, your sick self dies and your healthy self is reborn. So there's a mystery dimension to this as well. And one of the things that's fascinated me, I've started working with this incredible woman in Athens, Maria Maragou, who's an author. She's written 9 books on ancient Greek philosophy, and her whole thing is very deep etymological analysis of the ancient Greek. She's a genius. She trained as a chemical engineer, but she's written one of the best-selling books in Greece about the Eleusinian mysteries. It's very detailed, very thorough, really deep, metaphysical and esoteric.
That sounds awesome.
And she led my retreat participants on the sacred way and kind of told us all about the various stops that the Mysti would make on the way to Eleusis. And she talks about how when visitors entered the Telesterion, there's these very similar ideas about the way that someone can be healed by darkness that's so similar to the incubation, like proper incubation. So the Telesterion is the initiation hall, but really the root of that word means perfecting rites. So the perfecting rites are carried out in this hall where the initiates of the mysteries of Eleusina would enter it and have, after a period of time, a direct experience of the gods and goddesses that are associated with Eleusis. And, you could say they're epiphanies, but I think they are experienced as out-of-body encounters of the divine directly. And Maria talks about how, 30,000 people would take part in the procession on the sacred way. 3,000 would be allowed within the sanctuary, and only a handful of people within the Telesterion would actually have this direct experience. So it's a real thing. It's not like Freemasonry where you have to go through certain sort of stages and rites and you reach certain levels. It's kind of, you either have it or you don't have it. Like you either have the experience or you don't. And I think it's interesting as well that the lesser mysteries, when the mystagogue names the mysti that can take part in this festival, they spend 6 months preparing themselves for this sacred way and for entering the Telesterion. So they aren't just having like a one-day festival experience. It's a long time in preparation of like laying the foundation to have the best possible experience. And I think from the descriptions, it sounds like people have out-of-body experiences within the Telesterion.
So fascinating. This is bringing so much to mind. Like even just the word teleste and these telestic arts and telestic virtues, as I think maybe Iamblichus called them. It's one of the Neoplatonist teachers. But there's so much that goes into that. I mean, that's like starting a conversation about one of the most throbbingly mysterious yet lost arts of the ancient world. But
well, I think that's why Maria is so amazing, because and why the Greek language is so amazing as well, is because it is self-illuminating and revealing. So although we may not know, like, written down exactly what happens, the words do really sort of explain the basic concepts of the various rituals and rites that took place. And one of the things that's fascinated me, because there does seem to be, Asclepius was celebrated on the 4th day of the Greater Mysteries, for example, and he does seem to be well celebrated in Eleusis. I think because of his involvement with ridding Athens of a plague at some point, he's invited to be initiated, and he arrives late, and they celebrate him arriving late by holding the festivities back until he arrives with Aegea. Is that in Pergamon in Anatolia, the kind of child god Telesphorus is sometimes seen as the child of Asclepius, and his name seems to come from the same root as Telesterion, and his treatment center was the final place that you went to. It's almost like a kind of healing initiation, and they talk about it being dark. And Telesphorus has, elements of light within that name as well, but also perfecting. So there is this idea that you're perfected in the dark, and then when you're revealed, when the light's revealed to you again, you're healed. And so, Kingsley talks about how early incubation came from when we were Neolithic hunter-gatherers. If we would be wounded, just like an animal, when it's wounded, it retreats to its lair and it just lies still and waits. And I think that It sounds boring, but if you lie still enough and you wait long enough, stuff happens.
Yeah, yeah. I have a friend who does long darkness retreats,
Yes. Well, I think
and
that's the closest that you can come these days to
yeah,
that sort of experience. And people underestimate how quickly you can start hallucinating. It's like
hmm
48 hours, you're already there. I think that's why, to me, I I'm inclined to think the Kykeon isn't especially psychoactive,
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
drink
yeah,
that they take, because I don't see why it would be required given all of the kind of pomp and circumstance and
yeah.
the preparation, the anticipation, the intensity of that experience.
Right. Yeah. And this is something that I've kind of slowly evolved my own thoughts on, diving deeper and deeper into all of the ancient Greek stuff. Is I just kind of took for granted, like, yeah, I mean, on one hand, I still think this to a degree. Like, why wouldn't they use
Mm.
psychoactive plants? Like, they're clearly very knowledgeable. They have a long history of, medicine that is like, people like Galen have immortalized just an incredible amount of wisdom that comes from that time in history. So clearly they're very knowledgeable. They probably had very advanced herbal knowledge, but at the
Yeah, they
same
were
time,
using anesthetics
right,
since Sumerian um, hospitals. In the temples of Gula, they were using combinations of mandrake and ryegrass and darnel and
hmm
opium, and
hmm
even practicing euthanasia. So anesthetic was a little bit more risky, but they were certainly, we know they're using fumigations of opium, for example, and opium was a very powerful and effective narcotic.
yeah,
So the poppy is probably more evident in the mysteries of Eleusinian than ergo, which is what it's often claimed was
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the drug of choice.
Yeah, ergot, which is has LSA alkaloids, which are sort of precursors to LSD. But it's also, yeah. I mean, this is the whole, for people that aren't aware of this. There's this whole now two fairly famous books, Road to Eleusis, and then more recently, The Immortality Key, that sort of goes into this psychedelic hypothesis for these Eleusinian mysteries that we've been talking about. And they're awesome books and really, really interesting. But when you start reading people like Iamblichus, or you start, reading about these sort of, I guess, philosopher sages who take like the Telestic arts and theurgy seriously, there's never any glaring references to like, then you ingest the sacred thing and then you enter it's nothing that overt. It always seems like it's based on purification, on ritual, on creating relationships with these archetypal energies or beings or whatever you want to call them. So I think to just jump straight to, yeah, they were all just tripping all the time, I think that's a little bit reductive and disingenuous to what the evidence is. That said, I'm not like, first of all, who cares what I think? I'm not an expert, but I'm not settled on it one way or the other, but I'm very open-minded to there being non-psychoactive routes into this realm, into these states. Like, clearly we're all doing it every night to some degree. So
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
all in there or in here or wherever non-locally it is.
Well, one of the things that Maria writes about in her book is how, and it's one of the things that really interests me, and I think it ties in very neatly with these spontaneous healing events that occurred during incubation at times. Is there's an account of a man who went into the Telesterion, and you can believe this or not. The validity of it um, is not not really as important as the concept, especially when we think about out of body experiences. So he describes going in blind and encountering the goddesses, and when he leaves the Telesterion, he can see again. And the Telesterion, this
Well,
initiation hall, so it seats 3,000 people. They spend many hours in there in darkness with these mystery plays being enacted, and it's very dramatic. They've been fasting for periods. They've drank the Kykeon, and for me, the Kykeon is the drink that Demeter has when she's refused to eat for ages, and because she's grieving of the loss of her daughter Corey or Persephone, And she stops at a particular. And when you go to the sanctuary, to me, it's the most potent sanctuary I've ever been to in Greece. Like, I feel like I'd been there before as soon as I was there. And it's one of the places that, quite unusual for a lot of the sites, is that you enter more or less on the sacred way. So we walked the sacred way from Athens, but the way the archaeological site opens, it's like you're walking the same way that the Mistai walked, and you just get this amazing sense for it, because the ruins are quite considerable. There was a lot of lavish building in the Greco-Roman period and in the Roman period of building like extraordinarily beautiful gates, for example, and temples and shrines. So you absolutely have this sense of walking along the sacred way. And for me, in the sanctuaries of Asclepius, a very powerful healing ritual is what they call the theohenia, which is sacred hospitality, this sharing the meal with the goddess, a kind of early form of magical communion. So by sharing a meal with the gods, you eat a portion of it, you burn the rest to go up as smoke to the heavens. You are kind of becoming divine in that act. And for me, the drinking of the Kykeon is more a kind of theohenia that would perhaps be slightly easier to administer for 3,000 people rather than a big feast. But they all bring their piglets as well. Maria talks about, you take your piglet as an offering to the goddess, and it's burnt in a hearth, or you could sacrifice it elsewhere. You could sacrifice it in Athens sometimes, but that's to symbolize the sort of lower base animal,
it's like a
filthy
catharsis
part of yourself. So there's a sort of, it's all the same components that are employed in the sanctuaries and the sacred precincts of Asclepius are essentially employed. So I think there's a healing. So you can be healed by epiphany, you can be healed by leaving your body. And I've tried to think a lot about what might that look like and how could that actually happen. And one of the things that it brought to my mind is dissociative identity disorder, when someone undergoes such trauma that like their personality kind of branches off. And I've read about how I mean, I don't know how true it is, but I have read papers and I've spoken to neuroscientists who've talked about how if you've got multiple personalities in dissociative identity disorder, one personality can have an allergic reaction, for example, to something. And if you call in another personality, that allergic reaction goes. So I think there might be something spontaneously healing about out-of-body experiences, so that the soul is perfected in that out-of-body state and return to the body, and you're then different. And I think that, you know, people talk about dying before you die at Eleusinian. That was the whole point of the experiences, that you die before you die and you learn that death is nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, this seems to be something that's imbued into every mystery initiation. Like you brought up the Freemasonic initiations before. Like, I don't know all the details, and I'll be a good, even though I'm not a Mason, I'll be a good, I'll respect their craft and not spill all the beans. But the Master Mason initiation is essentially a death and rebirth ritual. You know, it's talked about in the Corpus Hermeticum. It's talked about, the Eleusinian mysteries are clearly symbolic of a catabasis and an anabasis. Like, that's the whole Persephone Demeter mythological arc. It's the same thing with the Orphic mysteries. You know, Orpheus went down to the underworld, he came back. It's something that is mythologically, it's a motif built into everything. And in my experience with altered states, all of the most powerful experiences I've had were absolutely like, you know, going deep into some kind of dark night of the soul, as deep as possible, just feeling like I'm an absolute piece of shit in some cases, and then coming out of that and being elevated. And this is something I wanted to bring up before, is the gods themselves in the ancient world embody this. Like, a lot of people don't know, you know, Apollo, you know, before he kind of hands off the mantle of the healer to Asclepius, Apollo himself is the god associated with medicine, but he's also the god associated with plagues. So it's like there's this this yin and yang, this light and dark within each one of these archetypes. And this is something we've really lost today with how
Mm,
we think about divinity. Like, no one thinks of Jesus and like Satan as the same being, right?
yeah.
Except maybe Jung. And then, when he's talking about like Abraxas being like the God above God that like holds hell and heaven within itself and stuff like that. But this whole topic of how the ancient world used to think about gods is an interesting one in and of itself. And I'm sure you have some really interesting thoughts on this.
Well, I was thinking about that with regard to Apollo also being so important with regards to prophecy.
Yeah.
And the idea that we have about prophecy these days is kind of limited to personal experiences of the world. But I think this is why learning ancient Greek is so essential, I think, or at least studying the words that you are interested in. So look at
Mhm.
something like apocalypsis, this
Mhm.
unveiling, this revealing. And for me, that's prophecy, when you feel and you realize you're part of everything. And that is healing. To have, prophecy is about directly experiencing the truth. It's not just about revealing secrets that have yet to play out in the real world. I think it's more kind of cosmic than that. And having some sense of your place in the cosmic order is very healing, because, on a cosmic level, we're kind of insignificant, but we have a point at which we can experience the entirety of creation, which is amazing. So yeah, I think Apollo's relationship with prophecy is an interesting dimension to healing that people don't often consider. But I think the truth is healing. Like, people often
Mm.
say that, people will become sick if they don't tell the truth, if they don't say how they really feel, or they can't express themselves. And so I think there's something deep in the nature of prophecy that is in and of itself healing.
Yeah, and I mean, right, there's also this motif that you see spring up from time to time about the relationship between mania, like or not mania, mantea, like seeing, like being a
Mm.
mantis, and death. So obviously healing, death, and seeing are all kind of cuddled up together in a lot of lore. Like, I'm thinking, for instance, in the Phaedo, before Socrates drinks the hemlock, he kind of reassumes his mantle of being a seer for a little bit before he dies, and he makes all these predictions about his accusers and stuff like that. So that's
Well, there's
another interesting.
a
Yeah.
long association with blind people having second sight.
Yeah.
And
Tiresias. Yeah.
yeah, and for me, like, looking at the mythology around the great below in Mesopotamian religious ideas, the the great below is where Shamash, the sun god, goes when the sun sets every evening. So that that realm is kind of the other side of day, and it's where all the things that are going to become part of the world tomorrow are gestating.
Mm.
So there's a goddess in Sumer, Mesopotamia, like Babylonian Assyrian goddess, called Nanshi, and her priests apparently, although this is hard to find any information about, underwent a kind of pseudo death ritual,
Mm.
because it was necessary to have entered the great below to know the future, because that's where everything that's going to arise tomorrow is gestating and developing. So it makes a lot of sense to me that dreams were considered, because, at night time when we go to sleep, I think the earth is carrying us in a way um, backwards. We're traveling anti-clockwise, and we're like entering into this kind of other world. And one of the things that I'm really interested in about dreaming is how you're always in motion, you're always moving in the dream. It is like you're traveling, you're always on a quest. So there is this sense of journeying all the time in the dream space. And I think that's something that ancient people really recognized. And it's something you can see in the Orphic gold tablets, for example, when, as a someone who's just died, you're being guided into Hades, and Mnemosyne tells you not to drink the water of Lethe. You don't want oblivion. You don't want to forget everything. You want to wait until you reach the waters of Mnemosyne and drink the water of memory so that you can remember your divine origins.
Yeah. Yeah. What is that? What is the sort of password you're supposed to know that people
I
were
am a
buried with?
child of the earth and starry heavens.
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
Permit me to drink the waters of memory so that I may take my place amongst the other initiates.
yeah. Yeah. I need to have, I have the gist of it memorized. Hopefully that's good enough if I'm confronted with a forked path. But
just don't drink the gushing, delicious, cool waters that come out of the roots of the shining white cypress tree, even though you're parched with thirst and bone dry.
Yeah, and I would imagine that would be the one that's crowded with all the sheeple that are just like, oh, let's go to this one. It's shining. It's cool. It must be great, right? Yeah. I don't know if that's like changing the subject. The other thing I wanted to bring up from before is the need, to experience the darkness, and how that's an element of healing, and of also of just having any kind of, I think, epiphany that really hits home, that no one wants to experience, yet I think is unavoidable, from, like I mentioned before, from my own experiences. How do you, as someone who's trying to bring people into these experiences, navigate that? Like, do you try to encourage people to go into, like, I would imagine you probably uncover trauma, you probably uncover dark things that people are dealing with from time to time, or maybe regularly. Do you encourage people to go into that, or do you let them go through their own process, or how do you deal with that?
Well, one of the things I've kind of come to think about life and death is that they're always woven together. It's not like something that happens at the end of life. It's part of the existing fabric of life. And recognizing that is quite liberating. So I think that, as a human organism, you've got cells that are being born and cells that are dying all the time. So death is always a part of us. And just acknowledging that we're part of this grander cycle of existence and non-existence. And I think that's why darkness is so vital in some of these perfecting rites, because it's about integrating light and darkness to be whole, to be complete, and understanding that death is always woven into the fabric of every fiber of your life. It's just always there. Hypnos and Thanatos are brothers, they're twins. So they're always existing all the time. And perhaps by bringing some consciousness into death, and by bringing some death into life, we can be more complete, more whole. And I remember when I was a kid, my preoccupation was, because I've had lucid dreams since I was little, was that if I could just always be lucid and perfect the kind of control of the dream that I was in, that I wouldn't die, that I would always be, aware of reality. So I think there's some of that. And I think I like the retreats to be really fun and really ecstatic, and people do love being in these places. And we can sleep in the Encumitarion, for example, at the Sanctuary of Asclepius. So I do dream incubation practices during the day, because one other thing that's worth thinking about is these kind of sacred sleeps weren't the same. Like you mentioned Kingsley, they weren't the same as just going to sleep at night. They were purposeful, lying down and waiting, and they would take many hours. It wasn't like just going to sleep at night and preparing yourself for a dream. And one of the things that I encourage people to experiment with is sleeping at certain times of the day, and sleeping in certain places, to see if they can connect with past memories of the place. So people often, when we sleep in the Encumitarion, will have dreams or visions where they see characters from the past, or they see Aegir, or they see Asclepius, or they see Serpents, because Serpents obviously figured quite significantly in those sanctuaries. And one of the things that I think is really important to encourage more dreaming is to act out things that people have dreamt during the course of the retreat. So, say, for example, people dream of people doing certain actions or movements or dances or singing certain songs or going to certain places. Will do those things. And then when you get this amazing experience of life and the dream overlapping, you start to wonder if you're just always dreaming. And I guess, that's another thing that I've come to feel, especially the more time I spend in Greece, is that the whole of life, the whole of everything is just one big dreaming. I would subscribe to the view of everything in the universe is a big dreaming process. And I interviewed for a festival that I helped put on in Athens last year or the year before. I interviewed Vasilis Adratas, who is a Greek scholar who lives in Australia, and he works a lot with Indigenous Australian populations and talks to a lot of them about their stories and about their ideas about dreaming and the dreaming or outer. And his interview was one of the most interesting ones I did. And I do think that if you want to know like the absolute essence of any cultural beliefs around dreaming, like that's the longest, most continuous and richly well recorded culture around dreaming that there is. And they have incredible ideas that just feel intuitive and correct to me as well. So one of the things I wonder about in Australia as well, they didn't really develop a kind of formal alphabet. The real world is still the story. So the world is always writing the story, and our dreams are always writing the story of reality. And I think there's a sort of purity in that where, with all the various languages that humanity have developed, there becomes more opportunities and more chances to be misinterpreted, to be rendered incorrectly, like not actually contain the truth of the thing. Whereas in cultures that have maintained symbolic representations of things or oral storytelling traditions, they've preserved with more kind of purity the true nature of their beliefs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense because I think that that's our innate natural way of being just ingrained in the natural flow, panther ray of life unfolding. And now that I'm saying this, it's so clear that we're collectively hypnotizing ourselves through the technologies that we are extruding and distilling slowly through human consciousness, through human history across the millennia. We're deluding ourselves into thinking that our own psychotechnologies are somehow more real than that. We get imbued in our language, then our minds get more imbued into our creations, then our civilizations, then all the way on up until the internet, where we're just like staring at these screens. And I'm totally guilty of this, by the way.
Yep.
All the time, as if this is the thing, this is what I have to be obsessed with, when really
it reminds me of the noosphere. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin talks about this noosphere, this like purely intellectual sphere where we kind of evolve consciousness or ideas to create this sort of abstract realm of thought that will kind of implode when it reaches this kind of
like a
Amiga.
singularity.
Does he talk about a singularity, like an Amiga point?
Yeah, and if we're evolving a noosphere right now, we are just psychically sharding into that thing. I don't like what the noosphere is currently composed of. Before we get too far away from it, I wanted to ask you what you think about the symbolism of the serpent and how that's evolved and what that is, because that's something you obviously see all over the ancient world, Egypt, Greece, that serpents intertwine Hermes' staff. Serpent is on Asclepius's staff. And I remember hearing that one of the best healing dreams you could receive would be to be bit by a serpent of Asclepius. And Actually,
I've wondered about that.
I'm just appreciating this now. Maybe the idea is because a snake poisons you in waking life.
The mirror is the
mirror.
medicine.
Yeah.
I've thought about this as well, and I've thought about how sometimes things like eating and drinking act in a dream act as agents to transform consciousness in the dream.
Yeah.
So I've had dreams where I've got drunk by drinking a drink, or I ate this brick of psychedelic meat once, and I had this psychedelic experience in a dream. But because your brain, you know, and your consciousness expects things to happen when you eat or drink something, it provokes novel changes in the dream state, your experience. So I think a lot of people have had experiences where they get drunk, for example, or they eat too much food in a dream. And one of the things I've thought about the poison is, if you get bitten by a snake, it could act as an agent of transformation in the dream. And there could be a mirror element of it, but perhaps it would just act as a catalyst for changes to occur. Panacea or Panakia is the daughter of Asclepius as well as Aegea. And this kind of global remedy idea, this idea of this all healing thing, could be that no matter what the condition was, the healing was the same because it was a medicine delivered in the dream state that kind of act as an agent of transformation from within, to kind of catalyze self-healing mechanisms to respond to whatever the agent was. So that's something that I'm very interested in, is how like taking substances in the dream state could be considered a form of dream medicine. And for me, serpents as well kind of reiterate this idea of, especially if you look at the rod of Asclepius, it's a kind of a gnarly branch with a serpent entwined around it. And I think there's something about this intertwining of life and death, the dead branch and the living serpent, and this completeness. And I've also read things about how Asclepius might be considered the kind of masculine component of the cure, and Aegea the feminine component of the cure, because she holds the bowl of Aegea. She's nourishing life. She is she's also the personification of wholeness and soundness. Aegea was the greeting that Pythagoreans gave to one another. And her symbol is the pentagram as well. So she's also often shown with Telesphorus, so together with this kind of nourishing of life, Telesphorus is her brother, and he perfects the cure. So Asclepius seems to be the one who kind of delivers the experience, or they did perform actual surgeries in the Asclepia, which is something that gets forgotten about when people talk about the dream stuff. But they were, there's records of them even performing sex change operations and things. But there's lots of surgical instruments that have been discovered on site, and they had skilled surgeons. And like when I research things, I often do like a dream incubation practice as well. And I did do this dream incubation practice because I was writing an essay about enkymesis and the root of ecchymesis, because there's a lot of differing ideas about what this sacred sleep actually means. Because enkymeterion means the place where people will put to sleep. So it does sound a lot like being anaesthetized, and obviously patients would have to be anaesthetized if they were going to undergo physical surgeries quite often. And there are descriptions in what are called the Yamata, the healing narratives of there's one description of a man who wakes up mid-operation and tries to get out because he's being cut open and struggles. But mixed in with Asclepius came to me in a dream, or a snake licked my toe and I woke up healed. So there's, quite often with a lot of materialist sort of scientists or archaeologists, they want to believe one or the other. It's like it was just a hospital where they did operations and they practiced early forms of medicine, or they were all just healed spontaneously in dreams. And I think it's everything and anything. I think that all of these things were happening and they don't necessarily negate one another.
That makes total sense. It's kind of like, I don't understand why it's not both and with a lot of these questions that for some reason get put into these false dichotomies, like similar to before the question about like the psychedelic hypothesis. It's like, well, why can't it be both? Maybe some
Yeah,
places did this, maybe some
exactly.
places didn't, you know. I wanted to ask you too about this theme that has persisted from the ancient world to now, of this either, you know, dying before you die, or a kind of second birth that occurs while you're alive. You know, this is like talked about in the Corpus Hermeticum by Hermes, who's like initiating, I think it's Asclepius, and he's telling him,
Mm,
you know, well, I'm not, and by the way, I'm not clear on the relationship between the Asclepius and the Hermetic dialogue,
yeah,
and if that's
me
supposed to have
neither.
some relationship to our Greek Asclepius we've been talking
Mm,
about. But either way,
it does. It does have a relationship with our Greek Asclepius, but yeah, I'm not sure entirely why it is Asclepius.
yeah, yeah. So anyway, this idea, you know, and so in this part of the Corpus Hermeticum, he's talking about basically being reborn into nous, or the divine logos, or whatever, and
Mm,
seeing like waking up to your divinity, your immortality. It seems like the same thing through some initiation was occurring in a lot of these different initiatory traditions. Eleusis, even Marie Louise von Franz has this amazing quote I've said on the show numerous times, where she's essentially saying that people don't understand that Jung's entire method was essentially to get people in touch with, she, and I believe she uses the word daimon in this quote, get people
mm,
in touch with their daimon, and to wake up to their innate self, their own divinity. And that's what individuation is like an
mm,
actual recollection of yourself and your own immortality. And it makes sense that that's what it is, because if you read the Red Book, um and there's this whole thing where who becomes known as Jung's sort of Senex archetype, Philemon. He's going on this whole Gnostic lecture to the throngs of the dead, saying that those who fulfill the Principium Individuationis become distant stars, like calling back to Plato's Timaeus or something, I guess, um, where the demiurge has a star for each human soul. I'm guessing that's where he gets that from. I've thought about this so many times. But anyway, there's this whole lineage of you either wake up to something during
mm.
life or you don't. And if you
Yes.
don't, you kind of just disappear or something, or you go back into the pleroma, is what Jung would
Yeah.
say. You just kind of
Well, I
go
guess
back into the divinity.
that rebirth that you might experience as an initiate is your opportunity to be born consciously again into the world. You know, we're born
Mhm.
into oblivion, we're born through lethe
Yeah.
to some extent, and to be reborn is to drink the waters of memory and really understand that you are related to the divine cosmos.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense.
And what I
That makes
love
sense.
about Minimosini as a goddess as well is she's a titaness. She is the daughter of heaven and earth. She
Mhm.
makes sense. She almost is the personification to me of consciousness as memory, um, materialized, like memory based upon your experiences of the world. She's the thread of consciousness that takes you back to the heavens. And she's the psychopomp in the Orphic tradition as
Mm.
well. And the Orphic mysteries, she's the person that you meet in the underworld.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, this tradition of psychopomps and the deities that are typically psychopomps, like Hermes. I'm drawing a blank on who's the goddess, Hecate. Hecate.
Mm-hmm.
She's also one. I think it'd be worth just riffing on what you think the significance of psychopomps is in general, because it's such a
Mm.
important motif in mythology, in fairy tales, in
Mm.
people's own experiences of altered states, or even just being out
Yeah.
of body. And this is something I'm so interested in for personal reasons that I can tell you about in a second. But um, yeah, what do you think? the importance of.
I think psychopomps and aneropomps and like Hecate, like you mentioned, is one. And Asclepius is sometimes called an aneropomp as well, is that they're leading you from a state of wakefulness consciously into the dream space. And the dream space is also the death place. So they are enabling you to take yourself with you to a kind of disembodied state somehow, or consciously leave your body and go somewhere else. So it really reminds me, like when I was a kid, of how that's how I thought I could transcend death, was retaining my consciousness. And one of my favorite techniques to enter lucid dreaming is the wake-induced lucid dream, where you hold on to your awareness, and it's like Alice falling down the rabbit hole in Alice's Adventures of Wonderland. You remember, you're in this constant process of remembering yourself into the dream.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like there's the it leads you into, like, in through the hypnagogic, and then what's the outward hypnopompic. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's like one leads you up, and there's also one that leads you down, or maybe it's the same one that leads you up and down. I'm not sure. But yeah, that is interesting. And then also, why, I mean, in the case of someone like Hermes, it makes sense because he's the god of thresholds. He's the messenger, the one that most often travels between the realms of the living and the dead, Olympus and mortals. But then some of the other ones, it's like, I'm not sure if I understand as cleanly. But I guess it does make sense that the goddess or the Titaness of memory would be one, because without memory, you don't have any directionality. You would just be like free floating consciousness that doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, it's like consciousness is like memory woven into a pattern that makes a substance, becomes materialized, becomes a personality. And it's interesting that she is the goddess of sense making, eloquence, and eruditeness as well to me. So she's also credited with naming all the things in the world. And it reminds me of, both Hermes and Mnemosyne have these roles as sort of sacred scribes of name making, of magic, which is often related to language. And Hermes, of course, is related to Thoth, and Thoth is this kind of cosmic architect and inventor of words alongside Seshat. So there's this really lovely phrase in Sumerian, I think, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but I think it's something like Shitir Shamay, which means the writing of heaven, which describes the constellations and the planets and the stars as being the kind of primordial language of creation. Like, if you can read the patterns in the heavens, then you can read the universe. And there's a quote in Irving Finkel's book. He wrote a book about the, I think it's an Assyrian or an Akkadian clay tablet that has a precursor to the story of Noah and the Ark. And there was a king Shulgi, said, in the insides of a single sheep, I can see the secrets of the entire universe. Wow. So there's this idea of like the as above, so below, this pattern that's imbued, that permeates the whole of life, that if you can understand that language, then you can understand it on any scale. And I think that's another thing that relates perhaps ancient perceptions, ancient understandings of the dream world, ancient art, and the nature of attention, is that scale becomes relative. I think quite often they say that children that grow up surrounded by nature and observing nature close up, they have a better understanding of how all kinds of systems work, because you can see on a small scale, if you study and observe nature really close up, the whole of the world makes a bit more sense. And you can start to create frameworks of how reality as a whole, or the universe, works, because nature is the microcosm and the universe is the macrocosm. So to me, like, it's a very, I love practicing dream incubation, because I think you can connect with the collective on this. I think everything is interconnected, and I think that's how all these things work. We are, as a cosmos, a single vast living organism that time is relative to our planet in terms of how we experience it on Earth, but there's also a much sort of greater cycles of cosmic time. And somehow I think as individuals, we might be able to access those sometimes.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, this whole idea of correspondence and there being just this network of synthema that are connected from the first source, the one Tohen that has emanated downward through an uncalculable amount of forms until you get down to our world. I mean, that's just such a seductive and beautiful idea for me metaphysically. And that's one of the things that really, I think, drew me to Western esotericism and Platonism, and these ways of looking at reality. And I also think that it is demonstrably true, and we're finding more and more evidence of it all the time. Like I did this video maybe, I don't know, 6 months or a year ago now, that is talking about what really is the evidence for there being this sort of as above so below kind of relationship that's like a new age meme at this point. And the answer is there's not only is there a lot of things people have probably already thought about, there are things that we're just discovering now. And one of them is there was an article, I think it was in Time magazine, and I think it was by the physicist Sabine Hassenfelder. And she's she's all over YouTube, and she's oftentimes debunking things. So she's not somebody who's like, a convinced panpsychist or something like that. And she was talking about this study that was done between, I think it was like Google and some neuroscientists, and they were trying to figure out if there are conceivably similar patterns between galaxies and neurons. And they were saying that not only are they similar, that in some cases it's almost hard to find any difference between the structure of the universe itself in the macro and like an individual brain. And there's all these amazing, pictures of like, if you illuminate these galactic filaments that connect galaxies to one another, and you look at that next to neurons that are connected, it's like indistinguishably similar. And I love coming across stuff like that. And it's just so clear. Like it's so clear that the ancients really were onto something with this notion that's in the Emerald Tablet that goes back to Plato's Timaeus and probably even before that there is some kind of parity between the above and below, and everything is following some kind of, if you want to call it, divine blueprint. And you can see it, as cliche as it sounds, in a single grain of sand if you know what you're looking for. Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised if the ancients could see it in sheep guts. Like I wouldn't be surprised if it's there for anybody with the requisite skills and mantia to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, often, and it's obviously becoming less fashionable these days to disregard the long-held beliefs of small-scale societies and indigenous populations, but actually, like a lot of that wisdom has been maintained by those communities. One of the things I used to collect was expedition accounts from the 30s and 40s into the Amazon. And they're really interesting because you get these European explorers going in really arrogant, thinking that they're dealing with savages that don't have any intelligence. But by the end of it, after these people have saved their lives, usually about 5 times, they realize how clever and knowledgeable they are about their environment, and they end up having like enormous respect for them. So I think that we're waking up to the fact that these people were right all along, and actually, because we lost our heritage, through whatever big cultural event, like Bronze Age collapse, whatever, that lots of wisdom seems to have been lost, and we became disconnected from local ideas and relationships with our environment through like mass migrations and whatever. But it's all still there. And I think this is the thing, like you were saying about recognizing symbols. When you start to recognize symbols, you can kind of see everything's hidden in plain sight. Everything's actually always been there. And like things like hieroglyphs and ancient Greek inscriptions, they're still there to be read. They're still available. Actually, there's an enormous amount of information that we can access, and actually it's one of the most excellent applications of AI, I imagine,
Yeah.
is to translate ancient text inscriptions, because it can calculate and make sort of computations of like vast amounts of data so quickly, and it might actually be quite useful.
Yeah, one of the things I'm so incredibly excited for is that I'm forgetting, is it the I forget what the town is, but the place where there's all of the scrolls that they can't read because they'll just fall apart as soon as you touch them. But
Okay, yeah.
they've started decoding some of them using AI and like X-ray imaging technology. And I think just a couple of months ago, they decoded one text that actually had um, a record of Plato's death and some like
Oh
quotes
yeah,
of
I
his
saw
that
that. Yeah,
that have
Plato's
never
Academy. Yeah,
that have never been known before.
is he slagging off some flute player or
Yeah, that
something?
was part of it. It was like he was on his deathbed,
Yeah,
and I forget, I don't remember the whole
he was
oh,
like criticizing someone's performance, as I recall.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was like
something like that.
someone was playing some string instrument, and he was like, just tell them to stop playing, like they're totally like off key or something like that. But there was something else too that was really cool from that story that I've now forgot. But anyway, there's like thousands and thousands of documents that some noble's library is completely waiting to be decoded. And who knows
Wow.
like what missing texts, I mean, God, anybody who's even remotely interested in this stuff, you're constantly coming across references to writings that have been lost. And anytime any of those resurfaces, it's incredibly exciting. So I have high hopes for that. Um, on that note, what, if any, lost things or places you could go if you could go back in time or have access to anything from the past? What would some of your top few choices be?
Good question. Well, I went to visit the Oracle of Trophonius
Oh yeah.
last year, and that, because a lot of the springs and rivers have dried up in Greece in recent years, or not even that recently. They've been dry for a long time. But one of the things I loved about that place is the rivers of Mnemosyne and Lethe are still flowing, so you get this real sense of it's still the same waters. I would love to have seen what that was like. The the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore at Eleusinian, I would like, that was an incredibly grand sanctuary that I would love to have seen. I would just love to have seen what the Telesterion looked like. Although you do get a great sense of being able to imagine what the Telesterion must have felt like, because you can still see all the stone seating around the periphery, so you can get a deep, a good sense of how big it was. And there is this kind of real festival like atmosphere the place still has as well. Like, you get a good feel for how people entered and moved around the site, which is really great. Yeah, there's loads. The Oracle of Dodona, the Sanctuary of Isis at Dion on the northern slope of Mount Olympus. There's just so many. I mean, that's the thing I realized with living in Greece, is you could just stay there forever and never get bored, because there's just so much. There's so many islands, so many, Delos, like so many extraordinarily amazing ancient sites to go and visit.
That's so cool. Yeah, I mean, it might be because of my limited knowledge, but Eleusis would for sure be high on my list. Obviously, seeing Egypt in its heyday too would be
Yeah.
something that I would
Well, next
die
year
to
I'm
see.
doing this dream odyssey around Turkey, and Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük and places like that as well, where you get a kind of vision of what's about to happen in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece, because and Crete as well, especially Crete, because there's the kind of gestation of those images and symbols of the sun goddess and the bull god. And I love Çatalhöyük. To me, that's like the ideal kind of design for dwelling. I love the way that they look, the little houses there.
I don't know if I know. I know Göbekli Tepe, but what exactly is? How do you Çatalhöyük?
Çatalhöyük. So it's a really early settlement, and it's Neolithic. It's not that much younger than Göbekli Tepe, and all of the dwellings were kind of built next to each other, kind of like honeycomb, and all the dwellings were accessed by the roof, and you had a ladder that let you in through the roof. And when they first discovered it, they thought it was a whole ritual site, because every single cell is kind of like adorned with symbols and paintings and aurochs, skulls and horns. And then they realized that it was just a place where about 80,000 people lived. It was like really big. And it's just a kind of fascinating, interesting community.
So are these some of the first people who are like settled and not hunter gatherers? Is that what they're thinking now?
I mean, who knows now? It's like, this idea that we found the earliest this is weird, because we will probably never find the earliest anything, because we're only finding what's left in the fossil record or what's left in the archaeological record. So it is a very early human settlement. Yeah.
Yeah. That whole thing with Göbekli Tepe being seemingly buried on purpose is very strange. And then there's also all these other, I don't know if tepes is the right word, but there's all these other sites that are probably the same thing. And there's like a whole network of them. I think
right? My friend's Alistair, who's coming on the Turkey tour with me, has just got back from the World Neolithic Congress in Şanlıurfa. So it's a really exciting area of archaeology now. And he's, it used to be called archaeoastronomy, but now it's called skyscape archaeology. He's a sort of expert in celestial and astronomical evidence in ancient archaeology. And there does seem to be a lot of that in places like Göbekli Tepe. He did, I think he co-authored a paper with Martin Sweatman about the astronomical symbols on the vulture stone in Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, really interesting. Really interesting. Last topic I'll bring up on that note is the ancient obsession with the night sky. And we in some ways, we don't really have to guess with cultures like the Greeks, like the Egyptians, because we know that they see the heavens as like the dwelling place of gods, right? Like, I mean, it's in Plato's Timaeus that the stars are gods. Like all of that stuff up there is filled with soul, with divine energy. But I think there's something we've lost in terms of understanding the ancient mindset, in terms of with these megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe, with temples, with chosen placements for things, with chosen arrangements for things. It seems like that there was probably some telestic and theurgic significance to all of these things, in terms of trying to select sacred places on Earth so that they can mirror some kind of energy from the heavens. What have you learned about that? What am I missing, if anything, there?
I think it was just a sort of innate geomancy, feng shui that people just knew, and it was perhaps specific to each culture, but sharing generally kind of broad themes and ideas, depending upon the location on the globe, what stars or planets are visible. It was specific to sighting. So I know in Crete, they aligned certain structures to the heliacal rising of Spica, the grain of wheat in the hand of the Virgin. And that's where they think the Eleusinian mysteries came from. And Spica was important in this. And it also occurs when Spica is very bright in the sky during the autumn equinox in September. Also, certain structures are orientated towards moon rising at certain times. Like, it was really important. And in Egypt, you have the stretching of the cord ceremony as well. So Seshat presides over the stretching of the cord ceremony, which would be the alignment of temples according to. There's a particular constellation in Egypt. It's the hindquarters of a bull, I think, that they look for in the night sky. So I think that this was something that was just really well known and established. And then as light pollution started to become more and more of an issue, or our gods became more mortal and more anthropomorphic, we moved away from the night sky and lost our connection to it. But in my book, I was reading about how in Australia there was an anthropologist, can't remember, Charles something, wrote a book about the people living in the bush who had a story for stars in the night sky, which, if you think about it, it's like an area of extreme dark skies. And they had stories about every single star, every single planet, like down to the third magnitude or some incredible amount of data. So there's something extraordinary about having that kind of intelligence and knowledge where you can orient by the stars and really understand your place in any given moment, by looking at the night sky to know where you are in, that's just an unbelievable like calibration and understanding of the world. And I think it's something that, you can get those apps now where you hold them up to the night sky, but imagine having that amount of information in your head all the time, like how incredible. So I think that's really, to some extent, that's what ancient people just did, because they had to know about the movements of the stars and planets to know when to go and collect, certain species of animals or certain plants would grow at certain times. And so the stars were always reflecting back to them the movements of nature on Earth. And so I think also this is why dreams becomes associated with celestial omina, and dreams occur usually at night. And so nighttime is when the gods are visible. The stars and the planets are visible at night. So dreams are occurring at this time where gods can have this direct influence upon us.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's the natural parsimonious explanation, is if you're living in the ancient world, that's going to be one of the most incredible and knowledge-filled things you can do, to your point of just all of the things needing to access food and plants and all the stuff for daily life. The more out there example or explanation potentially that I think that there's circumstantial evidence for is, I think that there might be, in that state of consciousness that we were talking about before, of like consciousness itself, out of body, what we would call astral projection, there may be some other perception of the night sky that reveals itself to you in that state. And the reason I say that is because there are some allusions to it in even like the myth of Ur and Plato's Republic, but there's more overt references to it in like there's this really cool tale of cosmic ascent in the writings of Plutarch. I heard it. Have you ever heard the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast?
I have, yeah. Schwepp.
Yes, yeah. I love that show. But he has this episode called like Tales of Cosmic Ascent, and one of them is a story by Plutarch, and it's about this this ne'er-do-well basically who runs afoul of everybody, and then some oracle says something ominous about him, like he'll become a better man in death or something. So then he proceeds to have a pretty like cataclysmic accident where he like falls down and like smashes his head on something, and then he immediately goes out of his body and starts going through the death process. He's led by his psychopomp upward, and eventually he I don't know if it's like the aether or something he goes through, but then he sees the night sky in its true form, and sees all of these sights basically, the Sibyl on the moon and all these other things. And of course, most people would not take that story as literal. But what's interesting is early on in the story, Plutarch says, I fear that you'll think this story is a mythos, but it's not. So then he goes on, and for anybody that's read the Platonic dialogues, it's clear that they distinguish between a logos and a mythos often, where it's like, we're going to go into a mythos now, we're going to go into a logos now, where I'm really going to give you something technical and whatever. So I find that stuff like that to be interesting. And then you hear stories from modern day out of body journeyers, and you hear some remarkably similar shit. Like I'm not too close with anybody who's been a prolific out of body experiencer, but I think that's about to change, because I'm actually going to the Monroe Institute in a couple of days for a retreat, and they're known to be like, the place where out of body experiences are kind of down to a science in some way. So
do you know
I don't know.
Gregory Shushan? Because he writes about near-death
don't.
experiences in different ancient cultures, and yeah, he talks about a lot of the things that you've just mentioned. He'd be a great guest, actually.
Very cool. Is he a scholar?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Egyptologist, but comparative religion now, I think.
Very interesting. Yeah, that sounds awesome. And also, who was the woman who led your
Maria Marigu?
Okay. Yeah, she sounds amazing too. And what was her book called?
The Path to the Divinization of Man.
Okay, wow. Sounds amazing.
Well, it's called The Mysteries of Eleusina, Path to the Divinization of Man, yeah.
Okay, I'll have to check that out too. But this has been fantastic. You have such a wealth of knowledge on all of these subjects that I love to nerd out about. Tell people about what you're conjuring into the world.
Well, I've got 4 retreats next year. So I have one in Egypt in April, one in Greece, where it's especially kind of exploring dreaming, oracular dreaming. So we're going to Delphi, we're going to Livadia, where the Oracle of Trophonius is, and Epidavros. And then I have the 2-week Dream Odyssey in Turkey, where we're exploring the goddess and the bull as kind of a prehistoric religion. And we're going to the sites of Eastern and Western Turkey. So we're looking at the really ancient sites of southeastern Anatolia and the Greco-Roman sites as well. And I'm going there with Alistair Coombs, who sort of specializes in especially the prehistoric religious stuff. And we're working with the Turkish Dream Institute in Istanbul, and a woman in Istanbul who came to Dream Palace Athens, who's a Turkish Siberian shaman, and who is studying shamanic practices and beliefs at the University of Istanbul as well. And actually, one of the things I'm really excited about is she's going to take us through the tunnel that's preserved at the Sanctuary of Asclepius at Pergamon and do a sound ritual, because the tunnel itself is kind of like architectural medicine. Like the thought is that as the pilgrims were walking through there, they were experiencing hypnotic, trance-inducing sounds. And there was a little stream that trickled down the inside of the tunnel as well. So it's one of the best preserved Asclepia in the ancient world. So I'm really interested to go there. And then there is probably like the finale of the year. We're going to go back along the Sacred Way to Eleusis with Maria Marigu again in September. And I'm running a retreat called Dreaming Waters, which is exploring the various mythic springs of the Peloponnese, because the whole of the region is very mythical. It's where a lot of the ancient myths, especially Heracles, and it's Argolis. It's just like a legendary place of heroes and mythical beasts and monsters. So there's loads of really fascinating places around. We're quite close to Mycenae, and it's an area that there were a lot of Mycenaean settlements. So it's a very ancient Greek stronghold the particular area where we are. And then it's my idea in September of bringing together all my Asclepiads, so various people that work in different areas, to offer a kind of creative interpretation of the complete Asclepion cure. So we have a dramaturge and a theatre director. So we're going to do dream theatre. I have acupuncturist and sound therapist, because music and harmony is really important.
Yeah.
We have an ancient Greek masseuse, like all these things basically to try to present and give a sense of the complete cure.
So cool. That is so cool. I want to come on that retreat to the.
Yeah, you should.
Man, that would be so fun. Can I ask you one more thing, actually?
Yeah, sure.
Tell me about the goddess and the bull, because so I've become acquainted recently with this family who they've become really well known in the sort of paranormal and UFO experiencer world, the Bledsoes. I don't know if you know anything about them or not, but Chris Bledsoe, the father, is sort of the nucleus of these experiences. He has a book called UFO of God out. But one of his most important experiences of all of this stuff is he had a goddess with a bull vision, who said a bunch of very oracular stuff to him in this state. And he was kind of shunned by the UFO community because it was not UFO-y enough and too mystical. But he deeply stands by it and holds that experience in extremely high reverence. So when I heard you mention the goddess and the bull, I just wanted to ask you exactly what you mean by that and what you're doing with that.
So in ancient Anatolia, in places like Çatalhöyük, there are these paintings on the wall. The aurochs seems to have been held in high regard, so it's this extinct type of bull. And there seems to have been worship of a solar goddess and an earthly or storm god that's also a bull. So both of those figures could be celestial. The bull is thought to bring rain, so the ancient people, it's believed, were worshipping these two deities, perhaps to improve harvests or encourage the growth of their plants that they relied upon. But it's interesting because it kind of, in later religions, you get the sun is usually a male deity, but in Anatolia and in Crete, the sun was a goddess, a kind of creatrix, and the bull god, I think, becomes associated with Poseidon as an earth shaker a bit later on. So there's an early form of Poseidon that was worshipped in Crete as well. But it's a lot of very shared and similar iconography. And Arthur Evans, who was the archaeologist, who's very famous for kind of writing a lot about Knossos in Crete and Minoan palace culture and all this kind of stuff, because he didn't like the Ottomans. He didn't like the Turkish occupation of Crete. He wanted to really distance the culture that he discovered there, or that he wrote a lot there, from Turkey, from Anatolia. So he really wanted it to be like the earliest European culture. But actually there's so much shared iconography between Anatolia, and things like the famous Kykladic, Cycladic figurines. Some of the earliest forms of those are discovered in Turkey as well. So there seems to be this like really clear continuity. There were obviously like indigenous people, Neolithic peoples living in Greece before that, but there was definitely sort of very similar styles of art and material culture.
Fascinating. I'm gonna have to look more into that. Thanks for indulging that curiosity. But yeah, I may actually go spend some time with this family, because they occasionally invite people to come see some of this phenomena for themselves. And
Where is it? Well, where are they?
They're in North Carolina.
I'd love to know about his encounter with the goddess and the bull. So if there's anywhere where it's recorded,
it is.
I'd love to see that.
It is. I had so his son Ryan was on my show recently, but he has a book called UFO of God where he talks about it, and apparently she in this vision said that, she has many names, but chose to tell him Hathor. So, and this is a guy, by the way, one of my favorite parts about this story is this family used to be extremely evangelical Christian, almost as conservative as you can get. And all of this phenomena has completely changed their mind about what's going on metaphysically and, what divinity is. And yeah, so it's interesting stuff. It's interesting.
Amazing.
Stuff.
I hope that more people will, especially with Christianity, sort of wake up to the fact that Christianity is the evolution of like various religions and cults that went before it. And yes, really, I mean, I'm fascinated by people experiencing divinity in any religion, but I see there's this like great similarity with them all. And Christianity in particular, when you're in Greece, the Greek Orthodox Church rituals and things feel very pagan and very Dionysian often.
Yeah. And also just reading something like, some of the early, now apocryphal Christian texts, Gospel of Thomas especially. But when you read something like the Corpus Hermeticum, and then you read these sayings of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas, it sounds almost indistinguishable. Like it sounds very much like they're talking about the same thing as also the Neoplatonists, and this idea of Christ being someone who's experienced the second birth and realizes that they're another manifestation of the nous or the divine logos, and is telling everyone, if you drink of me, you will wake up to it as well. It's clearly coming
Maria
out.
Marigu was talking about how when the Romans were kind of destroying the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore at Eleusis, that because Plato's Academy is not far from the site, that the philosophers or the people there, the teachers there, were often working as the hierophants. And so they saved all of the rites and sacraments and rituals of Eleusis, and kind of, because they had high standing in Athenian society, inserted it into the developing Greek Orthodoxy. So that actually, when you watch the kinds of traditions, especially Easter, is amazing. Like Greece, it just feels like, Jesus is Dionysus. And, you absolutely get a sense of it's the same thing.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look into some of these Greek Orthodox things. What's funny is, on a personal note, maybe I will or won't keep this in, but my little brother's girlfriend comes from a Greek family, and her whole family is Greek Orthodox. And she's like not real into it, but as soon as she said that, I was like, maybe I need to sneak into one of your church gatherings sometime and see what's going on.
Well, when you hear like a mass in Greek, the words are of the gods. It's still the same gods' names that we're used to, like Theos, and you can hear it all. It's great.
Yeah, that is cool. Well, thanks for doing this. This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm sure we could have many conversations.
Yeah, best to have a conversation over a Freddo in Greece, perhaps next time.